But part of what this work shows is that the greater the transparency and the greater the acknowledgement of the balance of give and take, the more we flourish. We have 3 general embodied responses to money. And one is this: I want you, I love you, come here, I'm going to have you, right? Which is, well, that's fantastic energy to have around money. And another is this: get away from me, you're dirty and disgusting and I don't want anything to do with you.
Hi everyone, welcome to Conscious Money. I'm really excited because my guest today is Dr. Ty Francis, who I met a few years ago when I participated in my first Constellations with Ty and Barbara Morgan in Chester. It was a very revelatory experience and I saw many things about my relationship with money. And since then, I've been a huge advocate, although I didn't really understand anything about constellations until I did my first one. Ty, would you be able to say a few sentences about who you are and your work?
Sure. I'm Ty Francis. My work is as an organizational facilitator, consultant, and coach. I work almost exclusively with global corporations and some public and government sector organizations. And I've been interested in systemic practice, I think, for as long as I've really had a serious business of my own. The 3 streams that inform my work are Gestalt, Constellations, and the work on presence of the Ridwan School. And what all 3 of those have in common is an understanding that looking at big picture perspectives, the holistic perspective, can be phenomenally useful. And so I try to integrate those 3 disciplines in the work that I do.
Mm. And how did you discover how did you discover constellations?
That was about 30 years ago. And I was a student on a Gestalt consulting program led by a teacher who's become a friend, Malcolm Parlett. And we were exploring case studies from the other participants there. And one person put forward a very complex issue that she was working with as a consultant in her own organization. And Malcolm said, I think there's this process which is very new and which is called the orders of love. And we might try and experiment and use the orders of love for this situation that my colleague described. The orders of love as a title is what Constellations work was originally called. And I love poetry, and the poetry of the title grabbed me. And he set up a constellation, although he didn't really understand the mechanics of the work. But as soon as I saw it, I thought, I have to find out more about this. This is remarkable. So Malcolm put me in touch with a friend and colleague of his, Judith Hemming. And Judith and I, again, this is about 30 years ago, collaborated. She brought her knowledge of family constellations. I brought my knowledge of organizational work. And over the course of a few years, through the Nowhere Foundation, we really began to establish the practice of organizational constellations in the UK. And the work has gone in many different directions since.
Mm. And for those uninitiated, could you explain what constellations are?
Sure. So a constellation is simply a mapping process that helps reveal the hidden dynamics of a situation. So it helps people get some understanding of what's going on below the radar screen of their conscious awareness. And so it's often used best, I think, in situations when there are recurring and intractable problems, where resource has been thrown and skill and attention and care has been thrown at cracking the nut of a problem over time, but the problem keeps recurring or won't go away, or goes away for a while and comes back. So those sorts of recurring, deep-seated problems are perfect for the kind of work that constellators offer, because you need to understand something that isn't so obvious. Practically, what happens in a constellation? There are different ways of doing it, but the original form would take place in a workshop. I would have, as a facilitator, a brief conversation, say with you or whoever had an issue that they wanted to explore. That conversation would help me identify the key elements of the system, the organization system, the family system, the social system that you were exploring. And I would invite you to look around the group in the workshop and intuitively invite people to represent the different parts of your problem. So if it's a family constellation, you might invite somebody in the group to represent your father, somebody else, your mother, somebody else, the family culture. So you can constellate any number of concrete or abstract elements, and these people would stand. It's not a role play. All they do is stand and feel into their embodied experience. And so what you have as an issue holder, Cleona, is this fly-on-the-wall perspective of the way that you hold the issue together in your mind, projected out into the workshop. As a facilitator, I'd go around and ask each of the representatives what their experience is, and very often it's bizarre because somebody moves and their experience changes. After that investigation, I draw on a body of theory, which we can talk about later, to suggest movements and sentences, and there comes this magical point in the process, which usually takes about an hour, where you feel things relax. And at that point, I might turn back to my client and say, what are you seeing that's differently now? So a constellation is a mapping process that shows hidden dynamics and helps clients get a broader and fuller and often more healing perspective on something that's been troubling them. It's difficult work to describe. As you said, you have to experience it. This is embodied systemic practice.
Yes, I tried to understand it before attending a constellation, and I understood it only after experiencing one. And yes, what you say is being able to see all the various factors that play out in your, in my case, it was a family constellation, but in relationship to money. You just get quite a quick bird's eye view of what's going on, as well as experiencing it. And from memory, in my constellation, the representatives just began like popping up, like there were people who were me as a teenager. And I was skeptical. I was very skeptical when I attended. But I came with an open mind, and I left completely, with an understanding of what this work was, which wasn't necessarily in the mind.
Well, it's beautiful work for one of the reasons that you've suggested, which is that once you've set up a constellation, once you've got representatives in the circle for different parts of your issue, you haven't given them the backstory, or very, very little of the backstory. And yet when they share their experience, what is surprising for clients like yourself is that their reported experience really matches with what you know is happening with your life, with your money, with your work. So there's an aspect of this work which we still really can't get our heads around, where the practice is a little ahead of the theory. But that's one of the things that fascinates me and others about it. Yes.
When you say looking at situations systemically, in my constellation, because I'm from India, there was also patriarchy. Well, I don't know what patriarchy, but there was colonization and the impact of that. And then there were people who had experienced wars in other constellations. They were holding on to stuff, or they were immigrants from countries where there was a lot of war. And it was really interesting to see the historical impact of events in their family that were absorbed, but still passed down to the representative of the issue holder.
Yes.
So why look at situations systemically?
Well, I mean, you've given a clue in what you've shared there. Whenever we get a bigger picture view of an issue that's been perplexing us and disturbing us, or has made us feel stuck, whenever we get a bigger picture view that includes more detail, that gives more context for what's going on, that helps us to see things that we haven't seen before. And that is a really important shift, because I know in my work as a coach and a consultant that I have only to half believe the client's story. If I fully buy in to the explanation they give for why things are, I see the world as they see it, and so I can't be of any use to them. So a systemic perspective helps us to stand back and develop a sense of what hasn't been factored in to the approach towards a solution yet. So it illuminates blind spots, and that can help us reorganize the stories that we have about ourselves, about our work, and about life in ways that can be potentially very transformational. I mean, constellations is usually a very moving experience. And therefore, a systemic perspective is healing in the truest sense of the word, because it helps to give us the whole picture. So healing and health is deeply related to the sense of wholeness that we can feel in our lives. So the French have got this beautiful saying that I came across years ago, and I do some work in France with this work sometimes. The French say, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner. To understand everything is to forgive everything. And so that's the beauty of a systemic perspective. It helps us understand what we haven't factored in before in a way that relaxes the heart, because it helps us look at the interrelationships between people and the elements of a situation very holistically. And that broader perspective opens our minds. You said that's what had happened for you, but it also opens our heart. So when we're stuck in some areas of our lives, we learn to include in our understanding things that we hadn't factored in before. And that can be like a real aha moment. So that's the beauty of systemic work and of constellations, that it's radically inclusive. I think that's why, we should adopt a systemic perspective more often. But in our culture, of course, we are very wedded to this notion of individualism, that we're individual bags of skin and that we're in charge of our own fates and we have agency. Whereas in a systemic perspective, there are some questions over those assumptions.
Yes. And can you do this work without attending a constellation?
Well, ultimately, no, I don't think so. However, there are ways in which the work can be used, but the most exquisite and powerful form of the work is in the constellation, in the sense that I've described it. So can you do this work without doing a constellation? For me, that's like saying, well, can you paint without picking up a brush? Or can you write a book without bashing away at the keyboard? Yeah, there are ways around it, but the constellation is the tool par excellence, in my opinion, for working systemically. The paradox that I mentioned is that in the work I do as an organizational consultant, I very rarely set up a constellation, but I've integrated the work over the last 30 years, as others have. There's nothing special about me, but that period of time and depth of practice and the teaching of this work has given me a way of looking at clients and the way that they describe their issues. So the constellation kind of happens in my head. And then I draw on micro practices like inviting clients to move position or offering them a sentence or two that can help. So that's not about setting up a constellation, because very often I can't just whip up a constellation in the middle of a board meeting. But I can draw on these micro practices that can restore some more flow. But ultimately, as you've learned, the practice of the constellation is remarkable. And when I first came across this work, I thought, there's no way that I can set up a constellation in front of my clients. They'll think it's weird. And indeed, some of them do. And as I've said, I use it very, very selectively and rarely. But when I do set up a constellation, it's remarkable how very senior organizational people in charge of billions and hundreds and hundreds of people, they get it instantly, because it enables them to map their issue in a unique way. And it gives them insight that they know they haven't had from looking at the situation from other perspectives.
And it seems like the world is changing in the sense that people in business are more open to using words like love or intuition, which maybe were considered less. Yeah, maybe we are becoming more inclusive and more open, and that's a good thing. I had a question about practically how can constellations help with, like, in businesses and organizations, like what are the kind of issues that one can work on?
In a sense, there is no limitation on the kinds of issues that can be worked on. There are different levels of a system. So I might be working with a chief executive on her leadership style. when you're working at senior levels in organizations, it's never about giving your clients more skills. It's always about helping them use themselves more powerfully as people. And therefore, a constellation can be used to help clients understand their relationship to authority, their relationship to their power. That always comes, by the way, from the way that we were taught to relate to authority in our families of origin as very little children. Okay, and yet this isn't about doing stealth work with psychotherapy in business. It's not that at all. It's about moving from the organizational system to the family system so that a leader's possibilities in business can be expanded because they understand what makes them tick. So that's one application of constellations in organizations. A very different example could be to help a business that's struggling look at its relationship to money differently, or to help team members who are at war with one another reconcile so that things can move on again and people aren't drawn into internecine struggles. It could be about looking at strategic options. You know, if we go for strategy A or strategy B or strategy C, which possibility will be most beneficial? So, you know, those are just a few of very many instances where a constellation can be really useful. And you can see that they're the kinds of questions and issues that are complex, right? That have multiple dimensions bearing down on them. And a constellation doesn't give you the whole solution. A constellation helps you see more clearly what is actually influencing the situation and helps you take the next most viable step forward. So it's, you know, it's not a magic bullet. And of course, seeing what's influencing a situation and seeing the best possible route forward doesn't mean that things magically clear up. You still have to do the work. You still have, as a person, to make decisions and to take action.
Yes, because it's a bit like improv. Your next action decides and the course of what happens, and you have to play fully your part.
You do, but what the constellation gives you is a sense of how the network of relationships in an organization hangs together. Mm-hmm. And so you're not improvising with any number of possibilities. The constellation shows you a limited set of possibilities that might be more fruitful for you to take action with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's, when I was learning the work, it was originally through a family systems therapist called Hunter Beaumont. And he used this very beautiful analogy. He said that a constellation is like that piece of moonstone that the Vikings used to hang from a piece of string at the front of their ships when they set off into the fog. All that the piece of moonstone did, which is the constellation, is say that direction is the one to go in. Mm. But you still need to hoist the sail, and you still need to row when it's appropriate, and you still need to, you know, deal with dragons and things along the way. So it gives a sense of the direction and the momentum that you can take that is useful for whatever situation you are exploring.
Mm-hmm. So what are some principles around constellations in businesses and organizations, like rank or orders of love, that it's helpful to know?
Well, orders of love, I mean, I still talk about them as orders of love, but that can sound a bit too unusual in some coaches' ears and in the ears of my clients. So I call them that when I'm training people, but actually the orders of love are the basic systemic principles that we work with, the theory base of this work. And there are the same systemic principles, the same orders of love in organizational work as there are in family systems. So Bert Hellinger, the originator, the founder of this practice, identified 4 or 5 key systemic principles that help things flow. That's what he was concerned with. Originally, his interest was in how do I restore the flow of love in a family system. So in organizations, I use these principles to see how can I restore the flow of energy towards the solution or to success somehow in an organization. So there are the same principles. Those principles are acknowledgement, time, place, give and take, which is sometimes called reciprocity, and belonging. And they're simple things, but they have profound implications. So acknowledgement is often not referred to as a separate systemic principle, but one of my teachers, Albrecht Marr, used to say that acknowledgement is fundamental to all of the orders, because acknowledging what is relaxes people and it relaxes the situation. Time is about who came first in the organization, because they have more influence than people who came later. So if you've served 20 years in your post in an organization and you get a new whiz kid in who's only been there for 2 minutes and they start telling you what to do, that's going to snarl things up. So respect has to be given to who and what came first. Place is a really important one in organizations in relation to your question, but Hellinger once said that in his opinion, the most weighty, knotty issue in organizational life has to do with people being in the wrong place. What does that mean? So a quick story. It was nearly 30 years ago. I was a rookie consultant working with a charitable organization in the UK, getting on well with the chief executive and with her senior team. And this one morning, I turned up, met with her before we went into a team meeting. And she said, something's come up, Ty, overnight. I need to go and attend to this issue with some of our clients. Can I let you update the team so that when I come in later, we can just carry on with the meeting? And I said, yes. The team never worked with me again after that meeting because I had inadvertently stepped into her place and they didn't recognize my authority there. In a way, I kind of acted as though I was their boss without meaning to. I didn't realize what was happening at the time, but that's a really vivid example of how you can only really do your job well if you humbly stay in your place. If you try to take authority that isn't yours, kind of things can get a little bit messed up. Give and take is another one of these systemic principles, and that has to do with the balance of money, for example. It is are people's pay and conditions at a level that are fair, perceived to be fair, or are people working harder than they think they need to get the money that they deserve? So if there's an imbalance in give and take in many different ways, people start withdrawing their goodwill. And the interesting thing about give and take is that often it can be as weakening to give too much as to not give enough. Because if we're over giving, people kind of feel a little bit burdened and obliged, right? So things can go wrong with any of these principles if things aren't balanced and equitable and transparent and fair. And then belonging has to do with really feeling your place in the system and feeling a sense of loyalty fundamentally. So those are the principles, but one of the differences about the application of those principles in organizational life is that, for example, the order of place applies to products and services, to stakeholders, to customers, to shareholders, to the staff, to profit. So we're looking at what's the priority order, what's the rank in terms of the amount of influence that these elements have in organizational life to allow things to flow. And this is very controversial, but Hellinger said that the most important influence, and it's an invisible influence in an organizational life, is the founder. And the founder has to come first and be acknowledged as the source of the business. Because, of course, if the founder had not founded the organization, nobody else in the business would have their place. Nobody would be taking money home to serve their families. The business wouldn't exist. So the founder has to be acknowledged as having a lot of influence. The next order of rank in a business is that the person or the people who maintain the structural integrity of the business, the chief executive or the director of marketing or the chief operations officer, so things like that. Now, there's an interesting point here, because sometimes when I'm working with family businesses or just a pair of people who've just set up their own independent business, I'll say, who founded the business? And they'll say, we did. We're both the founders. But actually, in this work, from my perspective, that can't be. Right? There's the idea only comes into the head of one person first. It doesn't just appear simultaneously in the heads of both of the people who call themselves founders. So the question is, like, which of the two of you really had the idea first and shared it first? Who's the source? And if the pair of people can't acknowledge the true source, the founder, there's going to be secret competition between them for their place, and things are going to get messed up. Again, a quick story about some supervision work I did a while ago, where a coach came to me and said, I'm working with a high-tech startup. They've got about 20 people, and they've got an investor who's helping as best he can. The two people who started the business appointed a chief executive, and they've got a team of, however many underneath them, but they're stuck. They can't make progress. The business has grown to a point, but now things are slow and difficult, and they're not getting ideas, and they're not growing anymore. What do I do? So we had a look at the orders of love, and when she said, the two business owners, the two founders, that gave me a clue. So I suggested that she find out which of the two was the founder. And then the next thing is, the investor had given himself license to roam around the offices and have a little desk in the office and to give advice in a well-intentioned way. But actually, if you're looking at the rank, shareholders and investors have the lowest rung of the ladder in terms of the priority in an organization. All they do is to give the business money. So this investor was acting as a well-intentioned business angel, but meddling in the strategy of the organization. So you can see that there are a couple of ways in which this business was stuck. So to go back to this order of rank, we've got the founder, we've got the people who set up the corporate framework, the products and services of the business are important. And here the order of time comes in, because the earliest products have made the most money, and they might have more importance than some of the more recent products. Then we've got customers, the staff, the profit, and then the shareholders. And there's a clear reason why there is that rank order in terms of the importance of things in a business. And that's because without the founder, the rest of the people wouldn't have jobs. Without the people who make the business work, the products and services couldn't find their way to market. Without the products and services, there would be no customers. Right? Without customers, there couldn't be staff to serve those customers, and so on. So these are very simple but practical rules of thumb. And when you start looking at some of the issues that solo entrepreneurs or major corporations have, the entanglements often come down to some way of not having these skittles lined up in a row.
Mm.
So those are some of the orders, some of the underlying principles. And the last thing, I guess, to mention, it comes from Jan Jacob Stam, who's a very experienced practitioner who also does work with family businesses and other kind of social organizations. And many years ago, he suggested that there's an additional element, an additional principle, which he called the leading principle. And that really has to do with the purpose, the founding purpose of the organization. So if you look at a healthcare organization, was the founding purpose meant to prioritize nursing services and that form of caregiving, for example, or clinical doctoring services? So getting the sense of the energetic imprint of the founding right is really important in these kinds of situations. So I've said a lot there, and I don't want to tie people in knots. I can see your face is questioning a few things. So
No, it's things are slotting into place. And I did read Jan Jacob Stan's book, and I was quite surprised and also happy to see that shareholders are not at the pinnacle of organizations, they are
That's right.
right at the bottom.
That's right. But you see, in lots of limited companies and public limited companies, the whole energy of the business is turned towards what used to be called total shareholder return, which is giving shareholders the biggest return on their investment possible. But it takes them from the bottom rung of the ladder and puts them above the staff. And if the staff feel that they're working, but they're not getting what they need in their own pockets, of course, they start to withdraw their goodwill, which is why examples like the John Lewis Partnership in this country, in the UK, I think one of the reasons it's been so successful is because it really acknowledges the contribution of its employees. I mean, they're called partners, and they genuinely have a vested and commercial stake in the business. So things like that can make a real difference to how successful a business is.
How does Constellations help us to look at leadership?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of the time, when people are promoted in organizations to a leadership position, it can go to their head a little, right? I mean, not with everyone, but sometimes. I mean, I've got an example at the moment of a client in the energy sector, and he's just been promoted to a regional leader. And the vice president of that company said, I don't know what's happened, but ever since he got that promotion, he's starting to tell people what to do, and he's behaving like, in a very authoritarian way. So a lot of us think if I'm the boss, I say what goes. Now, of course, to some extent, that's true. But one of the ways in which Constellations helps with leadership is to give leaders an understanding that they are in service of the organization. They aren't the big cheese. They aren't the be-all and the end-all. So this work helps to promote a kind of cultural ecology where leaders understand that they are in service of the whole organization, that if they make decisions in a way that has the good of the whole operation in mind, things can flourish. And again, this sounds obvious, but what happens is that leaders in large corporations get promoted to, say, a board position, and they have to represent the interests of their function. So if I'm the finance director, I'm partial to the interests of the people in the finance department. And if I'm the marketing manager, I'm partial to the interests of the people in the marketing department. So we can inherit a kind of siloed view of the organization that can stop us as senior leaders from seeing the good of the whole organization. So leaders have to learn to be a little bit disloyal to their function so that they can see that decisions need to be made that are about the good of the greater whole. And this is fascinating because if people on a team think that a leader is partial to any one person or any one team, they start to withdraw their followership. They start to mistrust that leader. So as followers, we need to see that our leaders act in the interests of the greater whole, and Constellations helps really to offer that perspective. So there's a second way in which Constellations helps, and I've mentioned this before, and that's in one-to-one coaching situations with leaders, where you can help a leader understand that they can use themselves and their authority in many more creative ways than they've learned to so far. And that means that we have to have a look at the influences on their authority from their family of origin. And again, that's not about doing covert therapy. Another way in which Constellations can help leadership is by helping leaders understand that subtle thing called presence. Okay, leaders lead because they have presence. It's not charisma, it's not showy and flashy, but presence is that quality that draws people to you, that gets people's attention, and that helps your authority flow well. And very often our presence and our authority is informed by our experience and our families of origin. So in one-to-one coaching conversations, without theraping leaders, we can help them see what their leadership style is like, and therefore how they might change that. And then the last way in which, and a really important way in which Constellations is helpful with leadership issues, is that this is about liberating leadership at every level of the organizational hierarchy. It's not about working with the men and women at the top, or just those people who have the title, the positional title of leader. Constellations helps the flow of leadership throughout the whole system. It removes blockages and barriers at different levels of the hierarchy. And it returns the responsibility for action to those people to whom it rightfully belongs. And that's really important, that I act in my role as fully as possible within the given boundaries of my role. Right? That's a form of leadership. It's about taking right action and using yourself well and wisely in service of the whole organization. So those are the three ways in which I find leadership can really be served by this practice and this perspective.
And why is acknowledging the world as it is important for a leader?
Well, it's not just leaders that is important for. Acknowledging things as they are is important for all of us in social life, in family life, in business life, at work. Because if we're full of ideology, if we're full of assumptions, if we're full of, limiting beliefs about ourselves, that kind of gets in the way. It creates a fog that stops us really seeing what our potential and our possibilities are. It stops us seeing what action will best serve moving things on. So seeing things as they are without the constraints of limiting assumptions and beliefs and the baggage of ideology is profoundly helpful. This is about the phenomenological perspective, as it's called, which is about getting rid of ideas and just trying to see what the truths are that liberate us in different situations. So it's not just leaders that acknowledging life as it is important to. I think that's important for us all.
And what prevents success in organizations?
So usually, I think we regard success as about accomplishing something, about accomplishing aims. Those could be, financial aims, strategic aims, operational aims, marketing aims. And for sure, things can get in the way of us. I think very practical things in the world can get in the way of us accomplishing our aims. I mean, COVID was a great example of things that got in the way of many businesses accomplishing their commercial objectives. When we try to achieve our aims, we usually try to do that through working harder, through acquiring skills, through getting better qualified, through better networking, forming partnerships, for example. So those are some of the ways in which I see us diligently striving for success. But Constellations has got a very unusual and controversial perspective on success. From a Constellations perspective, we think that success is limited by factors outside of our conscious perception. Now, Bert Hellinger, as I said, the originator of this work, says that success comes through accepting our father and our mother just as they are. But when I first came across that, it kind of blew my mind, and I thought, what on earth does he mean? But to the extent that each of us can say in our hearts, dear father, dear mother, I take you as my parents just as you are. You're the best and only parents for me. That sort of relaxes something, because our parents gave us life. So if there is any way in which we reject our parents, we kind of reject the life that we were given. If we say, oh, my dad was terrible and my mum was terrible, I don't want anything to do with them, well, that has a knock-on effect in terms of your ability to really reach out into the world and grab opportunities and fulfill your potential. Now, this is controversial because many of us have had sometimes even traumatized childhoods with mothers and fathers who might have seemed less than adequate. But however difficult our childhoods were, and this isn't to excuse those parents at all, there is one inescapable fact. Those parents gave you life. And even just saying yet, just at that level is true. They might have messed up from the moment they gave me life and I was born, but that's true. That starts to shift your sense of possibility in the world. This is linked to a body of theory kind of called the interrupted reaching out movement, which is really fascinating, which suggests that as children, as little toddlers, we want something, so we make a noise and we reach out for it. And if we are often enough given what we're reaching for and helped to go for and grab what we're reaching for, it could be a toy or a cuddly bear, even at that level when we're very little, then we start to think, oh, I can have what I want here. This is how to do it. I can mobilize. But if for whatever reason in our attachment to our parents, things went a little bit off key, and we learned, well, it's difficult for me to have what I want because mum's in the way and dad's in the way and this isn't right, or they didn't love me enough. When we can start when we're very young to be caught up in a pattern of believing that we can't have what we want. Okay. So that's in psychology, that's called an object relationship, where we start to superimpose a pattern from the way that mum and dad related to us as infants just onto the world at large. So we might believe I can't have all the money that I want, or I can't have the job that I want, or I can't make the most of an independent career, or whatever it happens to be. That pattern has got us in its grip. So when we start to look at the relationship that we had to our parents, when we start to accept our parents with all of their mess ups as the best parents for us, we start to interfere in that pattern, and we start to see that, well, perhaps I do have a little more elbow room. Perhaps there are opportunities now that, if I'm not governed by that belief, that I can grab, so we can experiment more. We have more elbow room with that pattern. So that's quite an unusual perspective on success, that success ultimately comes from taking our mothers and our fathers just as they are. But it's got some deep-seated psychological precedents for it. And of course, you know, I've seen this time after time, as you might have done in the constellation that you did, that that's a very liberating movement.
Yeah. And to have gratitude for that life, to feel grateful. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Regardless, you know, is to have gratitude for the life that we had with the parents that we had, regardless of the cost to us.
Yeah.
Okay. That's seeing and taking things as they are. And it's kind of it's a hard position. You can't just flick a switch and get there. You know, it's taken me many years in my own life with my relationship with my father, who died many years ago. It's taken me many years in my life to kind of find some inner peace with him. But I know that it's resourced me in ways that I couldn't have imagined. I don't have to effort so much, for example. I have a little more self-belief. I feel a little more agency. And I mean, this is one of the gifts of constellations. It deals with the drag factors that hold us back, the things that impede our success, by looking at some of the deepest roots of what makes us tick.
And Bert Hellinger even went so far as to say that success has the face of mother.
He did say that success has the face of the mother. And again, it's related to the same bit of theory, because when we're born, you know, I'm making this movement because, you know, mums and dads, of course, they hold the child here. Okay, so the first face that the child connects with when the child wants food is usually the mother's face. I mean, this isn't so gendered. Fathers can feed the baby as well, of course, right? But that optimal distance of the child's eye to the mother's face, when the baby is hungry and the mother puts it to her breast or feeds the baby somehow, that baby is striving for something, for food. And it's the mother that is able, stereotypically, to offer something. But success also has the face of the father, because fathers have a different place in our development from about the age of 2 or 3. Fathers come into a different sphere of influence over a little child. So the role generally of the mothering person in the family is when a little child is experimenting and going and playing, and they fall over and they graze their knee and they start crying. The mothering response, whether it's done by the mother or father, but the mothering response is to say, oh, come here. And it's returning to that loving embrace which soothes the child. Around about 3 years old, little child falls over and grazes his or her knee. Good fathering is about saying, you're okay, go on, keep going, keep playing, you'll be all right. Which is equally powerful in the child's development, because the child then learns, oh, when there's a setback, I can, with some encouragement, keep moving forward. So these influences have a profound effect on our ability to be successful in the world, to overcome obstacles and to endure hardship and to have setbacks. When we feel loved and supported to move forward from the well of our family of origin, more is possible for us.
Mm. And in same-sex relationships, I imagine one person would have that energetic movement more, perhaps.
Well, yes and no, because the important thing isn't. This is a controversial bit of theory, and it's difficult to capture it in a nutshell. Mothers have a special place. Birth mothers have a special place because they carry the child. They're the root, like life comes to us through our mother. Okay. So mothers definitely have a special place here. And yet in same-sex relationships, whether it's between 2 women or 2 men or people who are non-binary, for sure, sometimes one might have more of this energy than that energy, or both are equally capable of doing this and that. So both energies are important to our wholeness and to our well-being. Ultimately, it doesn't come down to the mother or the father or the birth mother or the birth father. But these are family system subtleties that, it's not directly my field of practice, of course. Except to the extent to which I have to know about these dynamics to help people move forward with issues that they have about money and work and in business.
Mm. It's really fascinating, and we may not have time to get into it, but I always think about adopted sons. So, for example, Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs both were adopted and created phenomenally huge organizations.
Yeah,
and I'm always curious about that drive.
Yeah, well, success isn't limited to people who have really great relationships with their birth mother and birth father. Any of us can be successful. Any of us can mess up. And there are some basic rules of thumb around this. So if the child knows he or she is adopted and the adoptive parents make a place in their hearts for the birth parents, that really helps the child feel backed up and resourced. Whereas if the adoptive parents want to cut out of the child's awareness and consciousness any sense of where they came from biologically, that can have quite a negative effect on the child. But I mean, again, this is the whole area of adoption is another specialized area within family constellations.
And I also read in Jan, you pronounce it better, but I'll say it my way, Jan Jacob Starr, who talked about fathers, daughters, and mothers. I identify as a father's daughter. I definitely have that, what I sense he speaks about. But do you use that in your work in organizations as well?
It's useful in teaching, systemic practice, and it's useful as one of the ways in which I can kind of orient to what a male or female leader's style might be. It's not the most important criterion for me in my work. It's an additional element.
Yes. And Jan Jacob Stam, he writes about the balance of saying yes and no to client requests of independent practitioners.
Yeah.
And what do you think is this right balance of saying yes and no?
Well, firstly, I don't think there is a right balance or just one best balance of yes and no. But I think what Jan Jakob was referring to is, when you're an independent practitioner and you've got, as I've been, and you've got this big corporate giant bearing down on you, and they say, we want you to do A and B and C, and you yes and yes and yes, you become too compliant and it weakens you. Or if you say, no, I don't do that, no, I don't do that, you become too obstructive and seem to be of no use to that client. So you have to find an optimal balance between compliance and resistance. And it's a difficult balance to achieve for many independents, I think. And this comes down to the order of give and take that I mentioned earlier. If I'm giving, and saying yes all the time to my clients, they can lose respect for me, right? They can lose trust in my judgment. But if I stand up to them and say, I don't agree in this situation, then that might be the best way forward for you. Let me suggest something else. Immediately, I'm looking at them at eye level, not as someone subservient to them. And so my place is reinforced and the balance of give and take between us improves. So there's no recipe that says, oh, you have to say yes twice and no 3 times in every client meeting. It's not like that at all. But you have to ask serious questions of yourself as an independent practitioner about, am I overgiving? Or am I undergiving? Am I being too compliant and letting my clients walk all over me, which is deadening and weakening and draining? Or am I being so feisty that they can't actually seem to get what they really need from me? So we each have to do our own inner work there and feel in the relationship what the appropriate balance is at any one time.
Mm. And feeling into the relationship also brings me to this pricing and pricing a fee for a client.
Yeah.
I think people can get quite entangled in their minds about value and price and offers, and then there's also this pricing entanglement where you might offer something and say, give me what you think it's worth after the course.
Yes.
And that's something I read in the book. Jan Jakob Stam said that it can lead to entanglements when the value is decided after. And I've seen that myself when I go for a course and somebody said, I'm doing it as a gift and you pay me, it takes up so much of my energy to weigh up what I just like them to say what they want, like this would make me really happy. Yeah. But if you're stuck with money, give me this, something like that beforehand. What are your thoughts?
Well, if you give something away for free, very often clients feel secretly obligated to you. And there have been a couple of times in my career when, for example, I've given someone a free place on a workshop and they've been the most disruptive person in that workshop. They might have arrived late, they leave early before the workshop ends, and they generally want to ask all of the questions. And it's like, okay, I'm feeding a beast here. Mm. And so I've got to be very careful about how I balance give and take. So if a client needs the work but genuinely can't afford it, which is the same for not just for me, but for many of us in independent practice, then I might offer a non-monetary exchange of value. So, what do I want? Can you give me some referrals or whatever it happens to be? The important thing is that give and take are balanced and feel fair. A different story. I've got a friend who's a well-known Buddhist teacher, has a retreat in France and travels globally, actually, as a spiritual teacher. And within his particular practice, within his discipline, spiritual teachers don't tell you what to pay them for turning up and giving a couple of days of spiritual teaching on a workshop. You give at the end of the workshop as a gift. Mm. And what my friend realized was that, well, that might have worked well in the days of the Buddha, but he would be giving excellent work for 5 days, and people might leave £5 in the kitty at the end of it. And he felt exploited. So that contracts the heart, that interferes with his giving, his free giving. So he started to have conversations with the people who are organizing his workshops to say, well, look, here's a range of fees from which it would feel respectful to be acknowledged financially. So again, it's about the balance of give and take. Giving too little can be weakening to the relationship and the work. Giving too much, because it puts others in our debt, can be weakening to the relationship and to the work. So price is always an indicator of value. Again, we have to do our inner work to really come to terms with charging what we are worth. Does that answer your question?
Yes. There's a lot of follow-up questions in my mind, but I'm aware that we also have other questions. But it's so interesting what you said. And also the Buddha and Dana. The Buddha his teachings really talk about the practice of generosity, and, giving to a monk in his culture was a very hard, expanding thing to do. It gets you lots of merits. And maybe in our culture now, we don't have that relationship of interdependence. It's not like a small village anymore where the monk relies on you for food. And it can get quite transactional. And then I think... I think in the system that we live in, because we're bombarded with sales talk so much, when we have a chance to give, there's a lot of interference in our true giving, because there's just noise.
Yes. I mean, some years ago, you reminded me, I was doing some work with a charity, and the charity had a policy of not acknowledging the funders, not the founders, the funders, because there were lots of people who wanted to give money to this charity who actually weren't doing it for fame and weren't doing it out of ego. But the charity got a bit stuck financially. So one of the things that they did to rebalance was to ask funders whether they would be prepared to be named, like in the annual report, even just one place once a year. Would you be happy to be named as somebody whose generosity has supported this organization? And if those funders weren't happy to be named, then the charity created a little plaque at the front of this building to acknowledge those who privately supported our work, who didn't want to be named. And it was just something that was an acknowledgement of the gift and of the generosity, and that restores balance. That helps things flow again. Yes.
And also I want to say, I've noticed, I've also let people come on workshops and, give me no money because they are financially strained. And then if there's been no gratitude or acknowledgement after, it really gets to me. And I think it's that, I thought there's something wrong with me. Why am I feeling so entitled to their gratitude? But I think it's that feeling of reciprocity.
Yes, it is.
That little bit of saying thank you or whatever it is, it just calms and relaxes.
Exactly. That's the giving back. The gratitude is the gift back. But when that's withheld, you feel contracted and you feel less wishing to be generous in the future, or I'm not going to help them in the future. Something closes down in you. So this balance of give and take isn't just through money, of course, it's everywhere in organizations, and it's so important. So there isn't a best price. I mean, sometimes with some of my clients, if I think that they're financially strapped and not able to afford my full fee, I'll say, look, it's important to me that I charge you something, but let's have an open conversation about what feels bearable for you, but also feels like you're acknowledging the skill and the work and the experience I'm bringing in service of you. So what is that price? Now, if there's an open negotiation like that, that can be really strengthening for both parties. Yeah, and they might say, £100 an hour, for example, but when they say it, I can tell that that's going to be a strain to them. So I have to check, okay, for how long and would that cause you deprivation? And of course, it's going to cost them something financially and some stress, but there's an acknowledgement of their investment in the work. If it's not free, more value is placed on it. They bring a different consciousness to the work. So there are ways around and through this. It's not about charging the most or what the client will bear or what the market will bear. There are ways around it, but the fundamental principle is, does it feel like there's fairness in the exchange here on both sides?
Yeah, that's really good. That piece was really good. Oh, good. There's nothing wrong with me for feeling resentful.
There's nothing wrong with you. This is a universal human response to an imbalance in give and take. You feel exploited, and of course that is going to breed resentment. I mean, there are different ways that you can deal with it. You might have a conversation with them afterwards and just say, I really felt that you withheld some gratitude and I don't feel good about that, and give them an opportunity for some redress. But, money is one of those things, as you know, that we project so much on and can carry so much shame that we all can avoid these courageous conversations, and we can all avoid transparency around our financial dealings. But part of what this work shows is that the greater the transparency and the greater the acknowledgement of the balance of give and take, the more we flourish.
And the other thing that comes up for me about money is that in my conversations, as you know, I'm a financial planner, so I maybe have had 10,000 conversations with people about money over my career. And quite often I notice that money makes people feel small. There is this aversion, like not wanting to look at money, which even I have. And I tell my clients, even I don't enjoy constantly looking at my pensions and ISAs. And I wonder if you can speak to that.
Well, I mean, I like this gesture that you made. And so at the beginning of some of the money constellations workshops that I run, I often say to the participants that we have 3 general embodied responses to money. And one is this: I want you, I love you, come here, I'm going to have you, right? That's fantastic energy to have around money. And another is this: get away from me, you're dirty and disgusting and I don't want anything to do with you. And another response is this, like, I want you, get out of my face. A sort of ambivalence. I mean, that third is really a part of my pattern. And behind each of these responses are the assumptions and the projections that we put on money. So if talking about money makes you feel small, of course you're going to do that. I don't want to feel small. You have to talk about money and you have to pump yourself up and be brave, but you really don't like it. So you have all right, I can earn money, but I don't really like it. I need to keep it at bay a little bit. And so that can help keep you in a situation where, rags and riches patterns of where you can get a lot of money and then it goes very quickly. And if you hold on to money too tightly, you can accumulate great wealth. But that can still be burdensome. I mean, one of the most fundamental things that Hellinger said about money is that the money is energy that serves life. And if we use money in a way that serves life, we don't grasp it and hold it and keep it, and we don't push it away, or we don't mess around with it. But if we use it to serve life, to move ourselves and our families and our businesses, our communities on in some way, money flows.
In the service of life.
In the service of life, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And that's why when you set up a business and it's serving a purpose bigger than just you and your little whatever selfish. I don't mean to say it in a judgmental way, but when you're serving a purpose that's huge, it's probably less obstruction.
Well, there are very successful businesses that seem not to be in service of life. We have to acknowledge that. Okay? But my experience of working as a consultant in some of those businesses is that people put up with hell in them. And so these perspectives are just ways of trying to free good energy, good juice in organizations and in society. And yeah, if you feel like I've got a purpose beyond profit that's important, that makes you more attractive to potential clients and customers, and it gives something extra to your employees as well as to yourself. So there's some sort of hidden benefits to some of the perspectives of this work, I think.
Yeah. To be a successful entrepreneur or source or founder, what could one do to swing things in one's favor?
Well, see, that's a really good and interesting question, because of course, and in the early days when I was going to Constellations workshops, and I was trying to look for a trick and a tool and a technique that would swing things, as you put it, in my favor. But that's not what this work is about. It's not about trying to manipulate our situation and others around us to have what we want. It's about trying to see what is possible within sometimes a very limited range of possibilities, right? What is really true and realistic. So it is not to try and find solutions in a constellation that help you as an individual just do more of what you want to do and to hell with the rest of the world. I mean, Bert Hellinger ultimately was talking toward the end of his life about the spirit mind and the movement of the spirit mind. Other very experienced and seasoned practitioners and teachers of constellations work talk about the greater soul. So when we're looking systemically, what's going on in Ty's or Cleona's lives, and when we're suffering and we might want to swing things one way or another, that's a very individualist and understandable perspective. But it might not be possible to swing things. We might have things to learn that matter to our inner journey that are deeply uncomfortable for us. So we're also ultimately looking at the operation of fate and destiny and those big forces in the world through the lens of this work. The perspective is not about fixing ourselves and fixing the situation. It's paradoxical, of course, that very often these bigger picture perspectives do help us feel more settled and do help us help things flow. But sometimes you just have to look at the situation and say, there's nothing I can do here. This is how it is. And with that, often doesn't come a form of defeat. With that often comes a sense of possibility. There might be unimaginable solutions from that place.
Mm. There's a big rise in solopreneur businesses, and lots of people are quitting and going, leaving the traditional 9-to-5 jobs and going to follow their creative pursuits, one-man band sort of organizations. How can the self-employed flourish with money?
And that's a great movement. I mean, I'm kind of part of that movement, or I was, 30 years ago, and I set up my own business, and I consult to people who are starting up their own businesses. You've got to attend to the nuts and bolts of business. You have to look at where money is coming from, and you have to look at how you're going to manage money. You have to ask questions about where your customers are coming from and what they want and who are the best customers for you. You have to put together some kind of presence, some kind of marketing presence. So there's no way of getting around the business basics. That's an important element. And if all you're doing is getting a flashy website and charging X and getting funding in place, doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a success. As we've said previously, while doing the business nuts and bolts constantly, you also have to be looking at the fundamental key to success, which is, am I really taking my mother and my father as the only parents for me? Can I secretly in my heart say, dear mum, dear dad, you didn't get it all right by a long stretch, but you are the best parents for me. You gave me life. If you can take your mother and your father in your heart, you reach out into the world more. You have a different kind of sense of stature. So that's often in constellations the fundamental issue that we're having to get to grips with and work with.
Mm.
You know, you might feel,
reminder.
you might feel, oh, I can't do this, you know, which is okay. I'm a bit small. I'm too small. I don't matter enough. So it can take you a while to get the support and the resource to feel your right size in the world. All of that in the family systems work comes down to your relationships with your parents and your family of origin, whether they're alive now, dead now, whether you're estranged from them or not. You're going to be limited in your reach into the world until you can kind of find peace in your heart with those relationships.
And could you say about ancestral trauma, like, you know, how this can play out in business, like communism or, you know, systemic things like wars?
Well, when we're looking at things systemically, it's like looking at one of those Russian dolls, you know, where a babushka doll, where you've got a small doll inside a bigger doll, inside a bigger doll, inside a bigger doll. So systems are profoundly interrelated. And it's bonkers to me to believe that massive global events in the world don't impact Thai's life. I mean, look at the world right now. Who would have thought that Russia attacking Ukraine would have such a disruptive effect on my money in terms of paying my fuel bills, or the amount of food available in our supermarkets, or Brexit, for example, and all the shortages that we had then, or COVID. So, of course, massive global traumas impact us as individuals. And it's folly to believe that we can be immune from the impact of world events. And that isn't just current world events, but global traumas carry a systemic legacy that passes down through generations. I mean, if you look at Nazism, is an obvious example given the origin of this work in Germany. That was a massive trauma and a global trauma. And there are people now, both Germans whose forebears might have been Nazis, and Jewish people and others who might have been incarcerated in the Holocaust, for example. There are people now who are still carrying some of the systemic legacy of those horrific events. So it's part of our inner work. I mean, we belong to the world, and it's an interconnected world. And I'm glad that we're starting to see how deeply interconnected the world is through some of these more recent traumas. Of course, I'm not glad about the traumas themselves and the suffering that they create. But systems hold themselves in balance according to their own architecture, and individual lives, like Thai's life, doesn't really factor in to the way that a system will hold itself in a form of balance. So I might be experiencing a little bit of pain, but the system itself, that might be the cost of the system itself finding its own point of balance. Again, this comes down to some of the basic theory base of constellations and the work of what's called conscience in organizational constellations theory.
Thank you. Fascinating. How can people find you and work with you if they feel, and also about the training work that you do in training people to do this work?
Sure. Well, I've paused training workshops and running workshops for this year because of the reconfiguration of my own business after COVID. But people can look at my website, www.meus.co.uk. And people are also free to email me, ty.francis@meus.co.uk. I'm on LinkedIn as well, of course, and that's another way to reach out.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Ty. This was the most enlightening conversation about business and organizational constellations, and I'm so grateful for the information you've shared so generously. Thank you.
You're really welcome. Thanks so much for your questions and for the invitation, Cleona. It's lovely to see you again. Go well.